All right, so Ben Scallon is an Irish journalist, and he's somebody that we began speaking with several months ago before these latest riots that took place in Dublin in the wake of the stabbing, because I wanted him to come on the show and talk about this censorship craze that is consuming large parts of the Irish elite and the incredibly draconian bill they're trying to get passed that will allow them to punish people for not just expressing, but being in possession of hate speech, defined in the most ambiguous and broadest way possible. And then the riots happened in Ireland and the case picked up, and we decided it was really important to have an Irish journalist on to help us understand what's happening in his country in Ireland. And so we have this Dublin-based journalist, Ben Scallon. He's a great independent journalist whose work I've been following for a while. And here is that interview that we taped just a few minutes before we went on air. It's great to see you. Thanks so much for taking the time to talk to us.
Thank you so much for having me on. It's great to talk to you.
Yeah, you too. So, as I said, there's a lot of attention being paid now to Ireland here in the United States and the West generally because of these recent riots and because of the government's response, including seemingly wanting to censor even further. And I want to talk about the substance of those in a bit. But you and I were talking about having you come on to talk about events in your country well before that, a couple months ago, I think, in part because a lot of this has been brewing all year. So before we get to the recent events, I remember hearing the Irish government complaining pretty bitterly back in February, the beginning of this year, about what they called an exponential increase in protests and suggesting more controls on speech were needed to respond to that. What were these protests all about throughout this year before we had the most recent one in the wake of that stabbing?
Yeah, so Ireland has seen an unprecedented number of protests regarding mass immigration in the past year or so, and that's been an issue that's been kind of burgeoning on the agenda for quite a few years, but it has really accelerated, I would say, since the start of 2022 with the advent of the war in Ukraine and the fact that there's been a huge influx of people to Western Europe from other parts of the world due to these kinds of conflicts. And so Ireland, for our part, being a small island, the Republic of Ireland has a population of just about 5 million people. We've taken in 100,000 individuals from Ukraine and many more from other parts of the world, which is obviously a huge proportion of our population. There are towns and villages all up and down the west coast of this country, which have had their population more than doubled by this process. And so that's going to give anybody whiplash, regardless of what your thoughts are on immigration in general. That's a huge number. And so there have been a lot of people across this country in various little communities who have said, look, this is just excessive. We want to be welcoming. We want to help people who are in a difficult situation, but within reason. And we can't go overboard. And so that's kind of the general sentiment behind this protest. And that's a new development here because for many years in Ireland, mass immigration was seen as a sacred cow that was untouchable and unquestionable. Nobody dared to utter a word against it for fear of being labeled an ist or a phobe or any of the other kinds of smear words that are labeled whenever you try to approach this topic from an adult direction. And so that's basically the state of play here in Ireland for the past year or so.
But that's really interesting because, of course, in every country where there's a debate over immigration, the people who are in favor of, I guess, mass immigration or who stand opposed to imposing any limits, as long as usually their communities aren't the one having to bear the brunt of it, will accuse the people who do want limits or are concerned about it, as you said, of being racist or xenophobic. All of those accusations that come immediately flowing against anyone who's just saying, no, I'm in favor of being welcoming. It's too much. We don't have the resources to assimilate people and endure it. One of the things I think is so interesting in what you said and what's happening in Ireland is usually when people hear about immigration debates in Europe or in the United States, but especially in Europe, I think people think about immigration from the Middle East, from Northern Africa, and from places like that. And yet one of the triggering events in this case, one of the kind of things that pushed it over the edge, seems to be this flow of immigrants from Ukraine. What is it that the Irish government did in terms of allowing or calling for immigrants from Ukraine? How many in number are there, and what kinds of people have these been that has led to people being so upset about it?
Well, I'd say, first of all, that a lot of the people from Ukraine who have come here are perfectly nice, normal people. There's not any objection to them as individuals, I'd say would be the general attitude of the Irish people. It really is just a number of numbers. They could all be all Canadians, and the objection will be the exact same because, as I say, 100,000 people being airdropped into a small country overnight, which is essentially what's happened, is just an unsustainable influx of human beings. And so I think that's part of the problem. The government, for their part, last year, they requested, or they didn't request, but they effectively said that Ireland could and would be willing to accept about 200,000 Ukrainian refugees from the war, which would be an enormous undertaking. We've taken half of that, and it's already a total drain on our system, which is buckling under the pressure. We now have hundreds of asylum seekers who are living in tents in Ireland, in the capital city, which is not exactly the red carpet treatment for somebody who's fleeing war, that they would come to a cold, rainy country in winter only to be put outside and the authorities tell them, sorry, there's literally nowhere to put you. So, and this also, part of what's frustrated people about this whole situation is that we've had an ongoing homelessness crisis for years in Ireland. There have been about 10,000 homeless people in Dublin, and it's been a key election issue for many years. And so for the fact that there's many people looking at this situation now saying, well, you couldn't help our own people who are in crisis for a decade, but suddenly we have the ability to harbor half the world and everybody who needs help from abroad. So much so that our Minister for Integration a couple of years ago, before the Ukraine war broke out, he put out tweets in a variety of different languages, Arabic, French, Georgian, and so on, basically outlining the fact that if you come to Ireland and seek asylum, you'll be given your own door accommodation within 4 months of your arrival. So that is essentially ringing the dinner bell to anybody across the world, whether they're a legitimate asylum seeker or not, that Ireland is the place to be, and we're offering all of these great opportunities, and so come on in. And what do you know, the following year, we see a massive influx of people. So, I mean, it's hard to prove that those two things are connected, but if you use your common sense, you would have to imagine that there is at least some connection there between these two events.
Yeah, the government says, hey, come, and people come. I think it's a reasonable assumption. What's so amazing about it as well, though, is there's this huge disparity between what these people were promised and then the reality of what they're being given. When they get there, they're kind of lured to Ireland with these nice sentiments, and yet the government either isn't willing to or isn't able to find the resources to fulfill those promises that they made to those people when encouraging them to come. I think one of the things this shows is that there's obviously a strong economic component to concerns about immigration, despite the attempt to suggest that it's always about racism or nationalism or selfishness or hostility to people who aren't like the people in that country. Has there been, as part of these protests that the government was complaining about all throughout the year, an explicitly economic component or set of issues that also have been driving these protests, or has it just been about immigration?
I think it's been a variety of things. A big component, actually, which has come up quite a bit, is the lack of consultation. A lot of people have mentioned this quite a bit, where they say, we're not even being asked, do you want this to happen? The first thing we hear from the government is, we get a notice saying, oh yeah, by the way, there's going to be 100 adult men, because that's actually one of the other details here, that our integration minister has admitted that most of the people coming are single adult males, which is not what a lot of people have in mind when they think about a refugee. You're thinking about women and children and old people and the infirm. And that's not to say that men can't seek asylum. Of course they can, but it's a bit unusual when that's the bulk of the people fleeing. You would expect the numbers to be, families. That's usually the thing that springs to mind when you think of helping refugees. So a lot of communities now in Ireland, they hear just overnight, oh yeah, by the way, 100 adult men are going to be moving into this hotel, which is right near your children's school, mostly unvetted people that we don't know a lot about, because many of them don't have documents or papers that might be for reasonable reasons. It might not be. We don't know. And you're just supposed to accept that. And in fact, they say, oh, well, we're consulting with local communities or engaging with them. But our Taoiseach, who's basically our prime minister, he just admitted in the parliament a couple of days ago that when he says engaging, what he means is we're giving you the information that you need to accept the new reality of what's happening to you, basically. So it's not actually a negotiation. There's no question that this isn't going to happen. And he explicitly said that no one has a right to veto who lives in their area and who doesn't. So you're going to have to accept this whether you like it or not. Really, the quote-unquote engagement process is just us telling you how it's going to be. So that's not really, I think, what people had in mind when they sat down at the table in good faith to talk to their local representatives.
Yeah, it is a kind of thing, again, that we're seeing repeating, this huge breach between the ruling elite on the one hand and the people over whom they're ruling on the other. They don't get a sense at all that there's a democratic process in effect, even though they nominally choose their political leaders. One of the things that caused a lot of attention to be paid to Ireland in the United States was this very viral tweet. And again, this was before the recent stabbing by an Algerian refugee to Ireland. And allegedly, I have to add that caveat.
Thank
you. Yes, allegedly, it's not proven yet. Right, he's not been convicted. And the newfound calls for hate speech, as I said, this has been brewing all year. And one of the reasons I know that is because I started paying a lot more attention when Ireland started advocating hate speech laws here in Brazil. They're desperately trying to impose one of the most draconian, but the EU, the UK, Canada have all implemented their own laws that allow control over the internet and hate speech in particular. And I think one of the things that really got a lot of attention was this Green Party Senator Pauline O'Reilly back in June. So we're talking about 5 months ago, several months before these last riots, where she gave a speech that was kind of the caricature of everybody's worst fears about what people who believe in censorship and are calling for censorship really believe. She was way too candid in saying what she wanted. And let me just play that for you and then I have a couple questions about it.
When you think about it, all law, all legislation is about the restriction of freedom. That's exactly what we're doing here, is we are restricting freedom, but we're doing it for the common good. You will see throughout our Constitution, yes, you have rights, but they are restricted for the common good. Everything needs to be balanced. And if your views on other people's identities go to make their lives unsafe, insecure, and cause them such deep discomfort that they cannot live in peace, then I believe that it is our job as legislators to restrict those freedoms for the common good.
Now, what was so stunning about that is she was talking about political speech. And the bill she was speaking about or participating in a debate regarding was the Criminal Justice Bill of 2022, which is also called the Incitement to Violence or Hatred and Hate Offenses. First of all, did this get a lot of attention in Ireland as well, a lot of negative attention the way it did in large parts of the West? And secondly, what was that bill she was advocating for when saying, look, of course we're coming to restrict your freedoms?
Yeah, so I don't think that piece of video that you just played would have gotten any attention at all, if I do say so myself, if it wasn't for my publication, which is kind of the only renegade publication in Ireland that's covering this from a critical perspective. I mean, some of our papers of record, these time-tested newspapers, were actually lobbying the government, advocating on behalf of the legislation in question. And that legislation is a hate speech bill, which would have extremely wide-ranging ramifications for this country. And it's caught international attention for good reason. I mean, the primary issue with this legislation, from my perspective, is the extreme vagueness of it, to the point where none of the key words that it uses are actually defined. So by that I mean hatred is not even defined in this hate speech bill. It says that hatred means hatred against people on the basis of X, Y, and Z characteristics, which is obviously a circular, meaningless definition. And similarly, it says that it wants to protect genders other than that of male or female. But when I asked our Taoiseach, Leo Varadkar, I said, how many genders are there that this would actually cover? He said that the government has no official position on that, which is obviously an absurdity. So you could potentially offend somebody who belongs to a gender which the government can't define, and they can't even define what hatred is, but you're still going to go to jail for a criminal offense potentially if you're found guilty under this thing. So it is so nebulous and vague to the point where anybody could potentially fall prey to it. And that's one of the major concerns that it's caused, not just here, but across the whole world.
I want to dive a little bit more into the substance of the bill as is pending now that the government's really trying to exploit the sentiments over these riots in order to implement. Before we get to that, let me ask you this question, which is, you were saying this probably wouldn't have gotten a lot of attention in Ireland had it not been for your critical scrutiny of it and your critical promotion of it, caused it to viralize, as I said, in the U.S. and a lot of places in the West, because like I said, it was just such a, I don't think it was a rare expression, but it was a very blunt expression of what people who advocate censorship really believe. One of the things, I've lived in Brazil now for 18 years, and Brazil in the last several years has also increasingly turned to extremely repressive measures to control speech on the internet, to punish alleged hate speech. It has all the same infirmities as what you've been describing, the ambiguity of it, who decides what hate speech laws, but people not only get banned from the internet, but can even get fined and go to prison if they violate these laws. And one of the things that really surprised me, I guess as an American, is in the United States, there are also a lot of people who favor censorship, but people will pretend that they don't. No one likes to admit, yes, I'm in favor of censorship. There's a constitutional free speech guarantee. It's inculcated as part of the American identity that we believe in free speech. Whereas in Brazil, the term free speech is something that they will just acknowledge widely that they don't believe in. They consider it almost a fascist value now or a right-wing value. And the difference isn't really in the attitude, but in the kind of norms of what people are allowed to admit that they believe. In Brazil, they just say, I don't believe in free speech at all. How is it in Ireland? I mean, is this kind of a speech? Is the reason you say it wouldn't have gotten any notice without you because it's just kind of the norm in Ireland to talk about the virtues of censorship, or is something else about this speech something that would have just evaded attention had you not really promoted it?
I think we've got a serious case of ideological capture and groupthink when it comes to our major institutions. I don't think the Irish public are in support of this kind of thing. In fact, I know they're not. Our most recent polling on this subject, which was done a couple of years ago, where a major polling company asked the public, do you believe that people should be allowed to say offensive things? Do you believe that hate speech laws should be on the books? And the vast majority of people said no. Moreover, when the government themselves held a public consultation, I think in America it's called a comment period, where you ask the public before you do something, hey, what do you think of this? They received thousands of responses in reply. And I went through every single one of those and I categorized them all by whether they were positive or negative. And in a story that my publication ran earlier this year, we revealed that 73% of the responses to the government's own public consultation were negative. So that's obviously an overwhelming majority. The public clearly aren't behind this, and yet they're driving ahead with it anyway, despite having no mandate. So I think there's a real disconnect between the general public and the journalists and the politicians and the academics and the NGOs and these sorts of elite groups, if you want to put it that way, who are all in a little club together and think alike and act alike. And then you go to the ordinary person on the street and they don't want anything to do with this. I mean, you think about the character of Ireland historically, a lot of stereotypes are true as far as us being a pugilistic people who like to fight. There's, a lot of truth is said in jest, that it would be very hard to shut up an Irish person who had a strong opinion on a political issue. I mean, going back even further to the Middle Ages, and think about Ireland's legacy as the country that during the Dark Ages, when Europe was being ravaged by barbarian tribes who were burning libraries after the fall of Rome, it was Irish monks who would go into that danger to retrieve books and bring them back to Ireland to copy them and preserve them. And that's why so many books still exist today, because we were so anti-censorship, and the idea of destroying literature was so anathema to the Irish psyche that our people were willing to go to great lengths and great personal sacrifice to preserve ideas for the benefit of future generations. So I think, in a nutshell, that is the character of who Irish people are. And I think that it's a very foreign imported idea that we should be shutting people up and silencing them and trying to stifle ideas we don't like.
Thanks for watching this clip from System Update, our live show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern exclusively on Rumble. You can catch the full nightly shows live or view the backlog of episodes for free on our Rumble page. You can also find full episodes the morning after they air across all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify and Apple. All the information you need is linked below. We hope to see you there.